Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Alonzo Martinez, Associate General Counsel at HireRight. Joining me is my wonderful colleague, Nicole Campion, and this is our Ban the Box overview, the second installment of our Background Screening 101 series. As a reminder, today's webinar is being presented for informational purposes only. It is not intended as legal advice. However, it should provide you with a foundation and talking points for you to advance your education concerning these compliance matters as you discuss this with your teams and your legal counsel. As always, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. In order to receive HRCI or SHRM credit, you must attend the full live session of this webinar. Credit information will be emailed to you next week. We are not providing copies of today's slides. However, when we send out your credit information next week, we will send you an email with a link to a recording of this webinar session. If you are experiencing any audio or video issues, please refresh the browser window by clicking F5 on your keyboard, or send us a message using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Doreen and Carrie are producing today's webinar and will be monitoring the feed for any technical issues. After the presentation, we would appreciate getting your feedback. Please take our brief survey and let us know if this session was helpful. We're planning 2 more of these 101 style webinars this year, so your feedback will directly shape our future webinars. So let us know what you think at the end of today's session. And again, please press F5 on your keyboard to refresh this presentation anytime you experience any audio or video problems. All right, let's start with the basics. What is ban the box? So ban the box are laws that delay when employers can ask about a candidate's criminal history. Instead of asking upfront, like on an initial job application, these laws typically require employers to wait until later in the hiring process. That's the box in question, the checkbox asking, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Fair chance laws are similar, but take a different approach. They don't address timing, but they do regulate how employers evaluate criminal history. That includes conducting what's known as an individualized assessment. We're going to talk about that in more detail a little bit later on. So as we move through today's content, we'll keep highlighting this difference between ban the box laws and fair chance laws. Ban the box laws answer the question, when can I ask about criminal history? Fair chance laws ask, what do I do when I see it? And together, they shape how employers should structure their background screening process from the job application all the way through to the final hiring decision. And here is a look at the current landscape of ban the box and fair chance jurisdictions that impact private employers at both the state and local levels. In each of the jurisdictions shown here, with the exception of those marked with that plus sign, employers can't ask about criminal convictions until later in the hiring process. That typically means after the initial application or once a conditional offer has been made. Now, for those jurisdictions with a plus sign, these are our fair chance jurisdictions. The law doesn't actually restrict when you can ask about criminal history. Instead, those laws require that if you're going to consider a criminal record in making a hiring decision, you have to conduct an individualized assessment. So the focus there isn't on timing, it's on evaluation. You'll also notice that some jurisdictions are shown in red. In those areas, the law applies broadly to all paid work. So if you pay somebody to do a job, they're subject to that law. So we're talking about not just employees, but also contractors, freelancers, gig workers. So even if someone isn't classified as a W-2 employee, the law may still apply if they're performing work for compensation. Now, you know, I love to say this, not all ban the box laws look the same. And that's where the chart really helps break things down. Most jurisdictions, those in that gray-black standard column, other than those marked with that plus sign, they simply restrict when in the hiring process you can ask about criminal history. But some jurisdictions go further. Take a look at that aqua column. These jurisdictions require that you identify the specific criminal conduct that may disqualify a candidate from hire and provide them that information as part of the pre-adverse action process. Then there's the blue column. Jurisdictions in this category require that you not only conduct an individualized assessment, but also provide that assessment to the candidate if you're considering taking adverse action. That means you need to draw a connection between the candidate's criminal history and the job duties and share that rationale with the candidate. Then we have that wine-colored column representing jurisdictions like Los Angeles and New York City. These areas require additional notices to be provided to candidates as part of the pre-adverse action process. In some cases, the notice has to follow a city-issued format, and in others, it must be delivered by both email and postal mail. These requirements can easily trip up employers who aren't aware of the procedural details. Finally, let's talk about those 5 fair chance jurisdictions marked with a plus sign: Louisiana, New York State, Wisconsin, including Madison, Atlanta, Georgia, and Gainesville, Florida. These don't technically have ban the box laws. In other words, they don't restrict when you can ask about criminal history, but they do require that if you're going to consider that history, you have to conduct an individualized assessment. And while those laws don't always require you to provide those assessments to the candidate, you do need to have it documented and completed as part of your process. So the key takeaway here is this: there is no one-size-fits-all approach. To stay compliant, you're going to need to tailor your adjudication criteria, your pre-adverse action notices, and your adverse action letters to the laws of that applicable jurisdiction. The good news is that HireRight's Compliance Workbench can help. It is a free tool that helps you manage these varying obligations by surfacing your relevant templates, your pre-adverse and adverse action templates, and the workflows for each jurisdiction, what you should consider as part of that process. If you'd like more information about Compliance Workbench, just let us know when you complete the post-webinar survey. And a quick plug, our Ban the Box white paper, which has just been refreshed, is available in the resources section of this webinar and in the HireRight resource library. If you're a HireRight client, you can also access our sample pre-adverse and adverse action templates in Compliance Central within Screening Manager. And HireRight customers, be on the lookout for a new sample Compliance Workbench template packet, which is going to hit your inbox later next week. Really excited about this new templates, so take a look at them next week. All right, this is easily one of the most frequently asked questions we get. Does the ban the box or fair chance law apply based on where a candidate lives or where the work is going to be performed? And I hate to lean into this stereotype, but here's the lawyerly answer: it depends. That said, in most cases, the law applies based on where the work is actually performed, not on where the candidate lives, in most cases. So let's say you're hiring for a job based in San Francisco and your candidate lives across the bay in Oakland. You're still subject to San Francisco's Fair Chance Ordinance because that's where the work is actually going to happen. Some jurisdictions make this explicit: San Francisco, New York City, Los Angeles. They all say their rules apply to jobs physically performed within those city limits. But of course, remote work has added complexity. So let's say your company is based in Texas and you're hiring somebody who lives and works remotely in Seattle. Even if you have no physical presence in Washington, you may be covered by Washington's Fair Chance Law. That's because your employee is performing work there. So remote work doesn't mean exempt from the ordinance. It means that you need to know where your workers are, not just where your offices are. So while it depends might be the classic lawyer answer, the better takeaway here is look at where the work is actually being done. Nicole, do you want to start to walk us through where employers can begin asking about criminal history and how timing rules vary across jurisdictions?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk through a couple different things with kind of what goes on before the background check request. I think this is where most people's minds go when they think ban the box. And I think a lot of people hear ban the box and instantly think, okay, job applications, that's what that means. And that's true, but like Alonzo said, there really isn't a one-size-fits-all ban the box law. So they really go beyond that. But some of them do a lot more. Some of them point to a different point in the process. So there's a whole lot to think about here. And I think that's one of the key takeaways for this presentation, really. So let's start off actually just a little earlier in the process. One thing I want to touch on really quickly, kind of the beginning, I think, of the talent acquisition process in a lot of cases, job postings, right? So you know you need to hire somebody, you're just starting to put together that job posting. What do you need to think about? Ban the box and fair chance laws, some of them actually impact what you can put in your job posting. So in some jurisdictions, you may not be able to say things like felons need not apply or no one with a criminal history will be considered. So something to keep an eye on and keep in mind just right at that beginning of the process. It's really important to start looking at these laws really early on, even before you get as far as putting those applications out there. So jumping into when employers can ask about criminal history, We'll go through a couple different phases in what I think of as the talent acquisition process. So we'll work right to left on your screen, which is earliest to latest in the process. Starting on the right-hand side with after the application. So in these jurisdictions, employers can't ask about criminal history until after the candidate has submitted that job application. So you can think of these as kind of your more traditional ban the box laws. They really are banning the box on the job application or the written question. It doesn't necessarily have to be a checkbox, but that's really what they're looking at is the application stage. So after the application, there aren't restrictions in these particular jurisdictions necessarily, but you can't ask before the application. And then moving just a little further in the process, one column over to the left, in these jurisdictions, there are 5 of them in the after qualified box. These jurisdictions go a little further and say you can't ask about criminal history until after you've decided someone is otherwise qualified for the role. So you still can't ask on the job application, right? It's still after the application, but then it's also after you've decided that they have the qualifications, the credentials, the experience, whatever it may be, that qualifies them for that position. And then a little further down in the process to the next column, this column is all about the interview. So timing here is really centered around that interview. So in these jurisdictions, again, you can't ask on the application. You can't ask before the interview happens. Some of these jurisdictions may let you ask during the interview, and some will be after the interview. So important to drill down into each one that applies to you and really pinpoint which of those 2 points in the interview process are relevant. But again, timing here, all about your interview. And then the last column on the left-hand side, where we really see the largest number of jurisdictions on this particular table after the conditional offer. So this is a fairly common one in ban the box laws. Employers in these jurisdictions cannot ask about criminal history until after they have extended that conditional offer, right? So this is latest, obviously, in the process. You can't ask on the application. You can't ask before, during the interview. It really has to be after that conditional offer has been extended. Just a couple of things I want to make sure to touch on before we move on from this slide. First, we're talking about asking about criminal history, but that doesn't necessarily mean just directly asking the candidate, right? It's not just the written form that says, have you been convicted? Check here and tell us what you've been convicted of. It's not just picking up the phone or sending a quick email and saying, do you have a criminal history? In a lot of cases, it's directly or indirectly asking about, inquiring, seeking, insert your word there, criminal history. So it could be things in some jurisdictions like running a public records search or ordering a background check. So again, just something important to keep in mind. Another thing that I think is really important here, there may be some exceptions depending on your business. So again, they vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I think you'll probably hear us both say that a lot throughout this presentation, right? Everything varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. This is one of those things. But as an example, if you're an employer who has a federal or state law that requires you to not hire people into certain positions if they have certain types of criminal history, you may be exempt from this requirement in some jurisdictions. Again, not a blanket exception, may not apply everywhere. So really important to look at each and every one that applies to you. Which leads me to my last point. It's really important to look at each and every one that applies to you and really read it. Understand the definitions, understand what the law is talking about when it says things like interview or conditional offer. I think a lot of us have kind of this concept or maybe a preconceived notion of what we think of as a conditional offer or what constitutes an interview. The laws may not necessarily always align with what you think of when you hear the term. So just make sure you look to the law itself to figure out what do they really mean? What are they talking about? One really good example of this that I want to just kind of spend a minute or two on is New York City. If you hire in New York City, you are probably very familiar with the New York City Fair Chance Act at this point. The New York City Fair Chance Act was amended a few years ago, and at this point requires what we call our bifurcated screening process or two-step screening process for employers who conduct background checks in New York City. And so in New York City, if you do background checks and you do criminal history screening, again, you're probably pretty familiar with this at this point, but typically what this looks like is your initial screening first. So employers will conduct, sometimes we call it phase 1 or stage 1 screening. At this point, you can't mention criminal history. You're not looking into criminal history. This is just about validating that someone is qualified for the roles. They have all the credentials and the qualifications that they need in order to do the job. think employment verifications are pretty common in this stage, education verifications, things of that nature. It's only after this first stage screening, when the employer has reviewed all of that information and they've confirmed that, yes, this person is in fact qualified for the job, that the offer can be extended and be considered a conditional offer. So it's based on the fact that you've already validated all of those other credentials. Once the conditional offer is extended, it can only be revoked based on a very short list of things, one of which is the results of the criminal history screening. Another is a medical exam, where that may be allowed. It's important to keep that in mind. After that conditional offer has been extended, then you get to the point where you can start talking about criminal history, asking about it, running background checks for it, those types of things. So this is where employers would typically order their criminal background check. Important note on criminal background checks, when we say criminal history screening in the context of the New York City Fair Chance Act, when we're talking about this two-step process, we don't mean just kind of the traditional county criminal search or national criminal search that most employers probably run as part of their background screening program. It's really anything that may pull in criminal history. So the New York City Commission on Human Rights has said this includes driving records, for example. So you would see driving record products in your stage 2 screening, because driving records by design have both criminal and non-criminal history in them. The DMVs don't separate it out. They don't give you, one report with criminal and one without. It's just one driving record with criminal and non-criminal history screening. There's so much to unpack with New York City. I feel like we probably could talk about it for at least a full hour, maybe even more. But we do have a lot to cover, so I won't spend too much time here. But I think the last point that is really important to make here, the New York City Commission on Human Rights has put out some FAQs and some enforcement guidance on the Fair Chance Act that I think employers may find to be helpful. So that's available right on the New York City Commission on Human Resource, or NYCCHR website. So you can give that a Google and it'll probably pop right up, or reach out to us if you need help finding it. But it's a helpful resource. I do recommend you give it a review. Also, of course, consult with legal counsel as you're designing your program, especially with New York City. There's just so much to unpack here. It's definitely one to keep your eyes on. All right. So the next impact, I guess, that you may see pre-background report from ban the box and fair chance type laws. This is another one I think is a little lesser known, perhaps. It's not necessarily one that, when you hear ban the box or you hear fair chance, you jump right to, oh, that means there might be a notice I have to give. But in some jurisdictions, there actually is. For employers who conduct criminal history screening, in some jurisdictions, there may be an extra notice that goes, in addition to the FCRA notices and all the other things that you will need to give to the candidate. These come in a lot of shapes and sizes. There's a lot of variation here. Some are pre-report notices, some are physical postings. So you actually have to physically put the notice up in the job place. So again, I'll probably sound like a broken record, but really important to look at each and every one that applies to you, understand the differences, the nuances, and figure out what you have to do in those particular jurisdictions. One thing I really like about this slide in particular in this section is it highlights a point that I think is also important to keep in mind. The requirements can be different from city to city and county to county within a state. So it's important to make sure you keep that in mind too, right? Just because you're in the state of California doesn't mean you're going to get one California set of requirements. As you can see on the screen, you've got LA, you've got unincorporated LA County, and you have San Francisco all in one state, all with different requirements. So just something else to keep in mind. And the last thing, now moving closer to that kind of point where you're ordering your background check, the last pre-background check piece that I think is really important to keep in mind is that some of these laws may restrict the types of criminal records that employers can consider. Now, what's on your screen is just kind of a sample, an example, I guess, a list of examples. This is not a comprehensive list of every type of criminal record employers can't consider. There are more out there. There are other types of laws where you may find these. For example, clean slate laws. They are still fairly popular. We're still seeing new ones passed and introduced into legislative sessions for consideration. Some of those do have similar restrictions where it does restrict what employers can consider as part of their screening process. So again, this is just a list of examples. It's not meant to give you every jurisdiction and every restriction that may apply to you. But it is a good set of examples because it gives you an idea of how broad these restrictions can be and how different they can be, right? You'll see in that right-hand column, we have some where the restriction is based on the type of offense. For example, California marijuana offenses is on the list. You have some where it's based on the type of record. So is it an arrest record or a juvenile record or an adult conviction record? You have some based on disposition. So is it a conviction or some form of non-conviction? Then you have some based on timeframes. Has it been 5 years since the conviction or 7 years since? So there's a lot to think about. And then some of the states, just to make it a little more difficult, will take all of those and mash them together and give you this nice little mix of all of those different things that you have to think about. So a lot to keep in mind with this. And again, this isn't a full list, but it is probably a pretty good overview to get you started. So Alonzo, I think we went through kind of a lot pre-report from job postings all the way up to what we can and can't consider. Do you want to give us some insight into what we need to start to think about after a background check?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nicole. So like Nicole mentioned, up until now, we've been in what we like to call the before stage. This is the part of the process where you're still getting to know the candidate, setting expectations. You've done what you're supposed to do from an application perspective. You've banned the box from your applications. You've assessed your criminal history questions. You've, told the applicant to either self-disclose or not self-disclose things based on certain restrictions. You know your timing, and now you've actually initiated that background request. That's the before stage. Now we're entering what I like to call the we need to talk phase. This is when that background check comes back, and if it reveals potentially disqualifying information, your next steps really matter. So this is where fair chance laws kick into high gear. How you evaluate the record, how you notify the candidate, and how you handle their response, all of that is regulated by these ban the box or fair chance laws. Because in many jurisdictions, you can't just ghost the candidate after the criminal record shows up. You can't just say, okay, we're moving on. It's not just a matter of being in polite bad manners. From a regulatory perspective, it could land you in hot water. So that's what we're going to cover here. So let's say a background report comes back and it reveals something that might disqualify the candidate. The Fair Credit Reporting Act, the FCRA, requires you to pause before taking any final action. So just a refresher, this is what you need to do as part of this pre-adverse action process. You have to send that pre-adverse action notice that includes a copy of the background report and includes a summary of rights under the FCRA, the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And you have to wait generally at least 5 business days before taking further action. Some jurisdictions have longer timelines. Nicole's going to cover that, but this is your federal baseline, at least 5 business days. So the idea here is to give the candidate a fair opportunity to review the report and provide any corrections or provide context regarding their criminal history. That's all that's required for all of the jurisdictions shown on the screen, with the exception of Atlanta, Gainesville, Florida, Louisiana, New York, and Wisconsin, including Madison, Wisconsin. In those jurisdictions, those are our fair chance jurisdictions, you're also going to have to conduct an individualized assessment, but you don't have to provide it to the candidate. We're going to talk about that next. So now that we've covered our baseline, what a standard pre-adverse action process looks like, let's talk about how some jurisdictions require that you go a step further, specifically by identifying the criminal record that triggered the potential disqualification. So in the jurisdictions listed on this slide, places like California, Massachusetts, Prince George's County, Maryland, and Seattle, employers have to do more than simply notify the candidate that the background report contains disqualifying information. You're required to actually identify the specific criminal record you're relying on as part of your decision-making process. So that might mean stating, for example, a 2019 conviction for theft was identified, or a felony drug conviction from 2020 was located during your background check. The idea here is to give the candidate enough information to understand what you found and why it may impact their employment without requiring them to look through that report and guess what you're basing this decision on. This kind of transparency, it serves a few different purposes. It allows the candidate to respond meaningfully by clarifying facts, by disputing inaccuracies, providing context behind their criminal history. It promotes fairness by making sure the decision-making process isn't vague or arbitrary. And it ensures that you're meeting these local legal requirements that go beyond the baseline protections in the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Keep in mind that as part of this whole process, how you phrase this matters. Your language, what you convey to the candidate, should be factual and neutral. You're not accusing the candidate of anything. You're simply summarizing what was reported and why it's under review. We're going to walk through a sample scenario in a moment, but for now, just remember, if you're hiring in one of these jurisdictions, you need to clearly articulate the conduct that could disqualify the candidate and include that information in your pre-adverse action notice. All right, so what I wanted to do here is kind of bring this to life with a real world example so you could see how you might handle this particular case. Let's just say you're hiring a warehouse associate. A candidate, let's call him John Doe, has completed the interview process and has received a conditional offer pending the results of a background check. Everything's going smoothly. But then the background check comes back and shows a misdemeanor theft conviction from 4 years ago. Now, your company's eligibility criteria says that theft convictions within the past 5 years may disqualify a candidate from warehouse roles, especially since the job involves handling goods and inventory. That makes sense. It seems job related, right? So now you're at a crossroads. You're considering revoking the offer, but remember, we're not there yet. This is where the pre-adverse action process kicks in. So you're going to have to send John a pre-adverse action notice that includes a copy of the report, the FCRA summary of rights, and because we're in one of those jurisdictions that requires it, a clear statement of what was found and why it might be disqualifying. So you'd want to do something like, a theft conviction was identified during your background check. We are reviewing this information as part of your conditional offer. This letter is not a final decision. You have 5 business days to respond or dispute the information. Now, side note, this is not a time to get creative. You just want to keep that language neutral, accurate, and professional. The goal here is to give John a fair chance to engage in this dialogue, in this process with you, correct the record with the consumer reporting agency, HireRight, if needed. And as we mentioned earlier, in most jurisdictions, you don't need to provide an individualized assessment at this stage unless local law requires it. For this slide, we're just focusing on the jurisdictions that require identification of that potentially disqualifying conduct. And that's it. It's really simple, but it's a great example of why you can't rely on the standard federal pre-adverse action letter in every hiring scenario. Sometimes you have to do a little bit more. So let's quickly talk about individualized assessments. The requirement for individualized assessments comes from the EEOC's 2012 guidance for the use of arrest and conviction records in employment decisions. You can do a quick web search and find that guidance. Again, 2012 guidance on the use of arrest and conviction records. So what the EEOC recommends is evaluating the nature and gravity of the offense, the time that has passed since the offense or completion of the sentence, the nature of the job sought, and really those are known as the green factors. It comes from a case many, many years ago. This individualized assessment process means that you have to consider whether the candidate's record is relevant to the job. You can't just automatically disqualify them based on their criminal history. You're going to see that criteria on the screen. Here's an important nuance that I always like to point out. If the candidate has performed the same or similar work post-conviction with no incidents, that is powerful evidence of rehabilitation. You should really weigh that heavily when making that individualized assessment process. So now that we've talked briefly about what an individualized assessment is, let's talk about when and where you're required to include that assessment in your pre-adverse action process. So in the jurisdictions listed on this slide, including all of Illinois, New York City, and Philadelphia, it's not enough to simply perform the individualized assessment behind the scenes. You also need to communicate to the candidate that you've done it and explain how their record was evaluated. So what does that look like in practice? Well, it means that when you're issuing a pre-adverse action notice, you have to include a written statement confirming that you conducted an individualized assessment. You also need to include a summary of that assessment explaining how you evaluated the relationship between the offense and the job. That summary should include those green factors we talked about earlier, the nature and gravity of the offense, how much time has passed since the offense and sentence completion, and the nature of the job. You don't need to be a lawyer here, right? Like, you're not expected to write a legal brief, but you do need to give the candidate enough information to understand that your decision wasn't automatic and that you gave real consideration to the circumstances. The goal is to show that your process was reasoned and it was fair. It also gives the candidate a meaningful opportunity to respond, whether that be by offering clarifying information, providing evidence of rehabilitation, or disputing those inaccuracies. Now, timing and format can vary. Of course, there's no one size fits all approach to this, right? So some jurisdictions like New York City, for example, have very specific rules about how this information should be presented. We're going to cover those details in a moment. But across the board, if you're operating in one of these jurisdictions listed on the slide, you need to incorporate your individualized assessment into that pre-adverse action step. So I'm going to take us deeper into the jurisdictions that go even further. This can't be that simple, right? This is where the pre-adverse action notice must include additional forms, deadlines, or specific delivery methods. Here are the jurisdictions that not only require individualized assessments, but also layer in an additional notice obligation as part of the pre-adverse action process. California and several of its local jurisdictions like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and unincorporated San Diego County fall into this category. In these areas, the pre-adverse action notice has to do three things. It has to confirm that an individualized assessment has been conducted. It has to include a summary of that assessment, similar to what we just covered in that previous slide. And you also have to attach additional required notices specific to those jurisdictions. These can include instructions for disputing the record, deadlines for the response, and language outlining the candidate's right to file a complaint with the appropriate regulatory agency in that jurisdiction. So let me break that down a little bit. In California, for example, the notice has to inform the applicant that they have at least 5 business days to respond and submit evidence of rehabilitation or inaccuracy. And it has to explain that a final decision won't be made by the employer until that 5-day response window closes. In San Francisco, the city's Fair Chance Ordinance requires employers to notify the applicant of their right to file a complaint with the city's Office of Labor Standards and Enforcement. And in unincorporated Los Angeles County, the requirements are even more detailed. The unincorporated LA County Fair Chance Ordinance requires that employers send the pre-adverse action notice by both email and postal mail, right? So 2 steps, email and postal mail. You have to attach all documents used in the preliminary decision. That includes things like the background report, the individualized assessment, and any other supporting documentation that you relied on. To make things even more complex, in unincorporated LA County, the law also distinguishes between non-exempt and exempt roles. If the role is exempt from the ordinance, say due to legal restrictions on hiring individuals with certain convictions like Nicole mentioned, you still have to follow the pre-adverse action process and send a notice, and it has to go out by mail and email, but the content and timing of that notice might differ. I'm going to cover that a little bit more in more detail. So I guess in summary, these jurisdictions want to ensure that the candidate understands exactly what's being considered, what their rights are, and how they can respond, and they want it delivered in a very specific format, which brings us to our next point. In places like Los Angeles and New York City, regulators have gone a step further by publishing their own individualized assessment templates. These are not optional. If you're hiring in one of these jurisdictions, you have to use either this government-issued form that you see on the screen or adopt a quote-unquote substantially similar format that captures the same required information. In New York City, that means completing the Fair Chance Notice, a written assessment that walks through the candidate's conviction history, how it relates to the job, and any mitigating factors you considered. You're required to provide this document to the candidate along with your pre-adverse action notice. Los Angeles has its own template, and it works in very much a similar manner. Whether you use the city's form or your own version, it needs to follow the same structure and include the same core elements, including the analysis and reasoning behind your decision. So if you're unsure whether your current pre-adverse workflows incorporate these templates or meet that substantially similar standard, now is a good time to review those and tighten that up. All right. So let's walk through what this process actually looks like in practice. Now, again, another scenario. Let's say you're hiring a delivery driver. The candidate, let's call her Jane Smith, has received a conditional job offer. You run a background check and it reveals a felony conviction for drug possession from 7 years ago. Now, your company's policy says that felony drug convictions within the last 10 years may be disqualifying for safety sensitive driving rules. So, this is something that you need to evaluate carefully and in a compliant manner. Here's where that individualized assessment comes in. Before taking an adverse action, you need to take a step back and assess the following. What was the nature and gravity of the offense? In this case, it was nonviolent and drug related. How much time has passed? It's been 7 years. What was the nature of the job? It's a driving role, safety sensitive, with potential exposure to the public and company property. But you don't want to stop there. Let's say Jane has also completed probation. She's successfully completed a treatment program and has a clean driving record ever since. In fact, she's worked for 5 years in delivery driver roles without issue. And here's the part that's easy to miss, but incredibly important. As I mentioned previously, under the EEOC's 2012 guidance, if someone has performed the same type of work post-conviction with no known incidents of criminal conduct, that is evidence of rehabilitation, and you need to weigh that as part of your decision. I get it. Doing this kind of analysis may not be your favorite part of the hiring process. I always consider it a little bit like assembling furniture that you bought online. You're tempted to like toss those instructions and just wing it. But if you skip a step, this whole process falls apart. So once you've conducted that assessment, you're not done yet. In jurisdictions like New York City or Los Angeles, you need to document the assessment, include that written summary with your pre-adverse action notice, and deliver any required forms using the right format and the right timing. You might say something like, we reviewed your 2018 felony drug conviction. We considered the time elapsed, your successful completion of probation, and your clean work history in similar roles. Based on the responsibilities of this position and our company policy, we're continuing to evaluate your eligibility. Again, the tone is factual, neutral, transparent. You're not making a final decision. You're just communicating where you are in the hiring process, that you've evaluated the information, and you're giving the candidate a chance to respond. In this case, it's favorable, right? So Jane now has at least 5 business days, and in some jurisdictions more, to provide additional context, documentation, or a correction before you move to the next step. Speaking of which, Nicole, let's talk about what happens when you do make that final decision and how the adverse action process fits into the fair chance process.
Absolutely. All right, we'll start off with kind of the more straightforward jurisdictions. All of the jurisdictions on your screen, these are jurisdictions with ban the box or fair chance laws that don't have additional requirements above the FCRA for your adverse action notice. So these are what we consider the standard adverse action notice, which just means the FCRA required adverse action notice. So remember, under the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act, if you take adverse action against a consumer based on their background report, you have to give them an adverse action notice that informs them of the decision, gives them the name, address, telephone number of the consumer reporting agency, lets them know the consumer reporting agency didn't make the decision and can't give them the reasons why the decision was made, and then gives them some information about certain rights that they have under the FCRA. So their right to dispute, their right to get a free copy of their report within 60 days. So that's what we're talking about when we say standard adverse action. Remember, that's required everywhere. So these requirements we're going to talk about in the next few slides are in addition to the FCRA requirements. They don't replace them entirely. You will notice on your screen there is an asterisk next to Washington, D.C. D.C. does have one added requirement. It's not necessarily specific to the adverse action notice itself, but in Washington, D.C., consumers who think that you have taken adverse action against them based on a criminal conviction have the right within 30 days to reach out to the employer and ask them to see a copy of all the records the employer got when they were considering the candidate for employment, and then also to get some information on their right to file a complaint with the DC Office of Human Rights. You can see an example of that up on your screen. The DC Office of Human Rights does make a notice available that walks consumers or candidates through this right that they have to file a complaint. You can get this directly from the DC Office of Human Rights. It's right on the webpage. So again, a quick Google should pull this, or a quick web search, I should say, whether it's Google or Microsoft Edge or whatever you choose to use, should pull this up for you. All right, so let's jump into the first set of requirements that go kind of beyond that standard adverse action notice. In these jurisdictions, if you take adverse action against someone based on their criminal history, you have to tell them that the decision was based on their criminal history. So Austin, Texas, that is the requirement. You just have to notify the candidate in writing that your decision was based on criminal history. The U.S. Virgin Islands add to that requirement. They add a right for the consumer to be able to have a discussion with the employer, right? They have the ability to reach out to the employer, talk about the decision, get an understanding of it. Portland has a slightly different take on it. In Portland, Oregon, you actually have to let the candidate know which convictions were relevant to your decision. So a little bit different, but again, still informing the candidate that your adverse action was in fact based on criminal history. So we'll walk through an example of what this might look like in real life, just a quick example. And this may look different for different employers. Of course, screening policies, programs are all different, but based on the requirements of these jurisdictions, this is kind of an idea of what it may look like for you. So let's say you're hiring a customer service representative who we will call James. James has gone through the interview process. You've extended a conditional offer. You've run the background check. On the background check, you found a recent conviction for fraud. It was less than 2 years old. You have a company policy that says recent fraud convictions might disqualify candidates from specific roles, which include the one that James has applied to. So you go through everything that is required up to the point where you make your final decision. So all of the pre-adverse action requirements, individualized assessment requirements that you may have, you've given James the required waiting period, which we'll cover towards the end here. James never reached out to dispute. James didn't provide any additional information, no documentation or anything like that. And so you made your final decision. Your final decision was you weren't going to move forward with hiring him. So now what? So your final adverse action notice to James, again, everything the FCRA requires, you can't forget that piece. But then on top of that, it may say something like a criminal record was a factor in our decision, specifically your fraud conviction from November of 2023. So you're letting James know that you made your decision based in part or in whole on criminal history, and you're giving them exactly the conviction that you used when you made that decision. The next group, in this category, we have adverse action where you have to inform the candidate of your individualized assessment. So kind of similar to what Alonzo talked through with the pre-adverse action notice, but this is required with the adverse action notice. Washington is one to highlight here because they are in fact new. This comes from recent amendments to Washington's Fair Chance Act. So once these are effective, employers in Washington will have to document their individualized assessment and then inform the candidate of that individualized assessment as part of the adverse action process. So we'll walk through quickly what that will look like in real life. So let's say you're hiring someone for a bank teller position. We will call this candidate Sam. Sam, again, went through the interview process, got a conditional offer, you ran a background check. This time you found a conviction for check fraud that was about 4 years old. You have a company policy that says convictions for financial crimes within 5 years might disqualify candidates from certain roles, again, including the one that Sam has applied to. You have once again gone through everything that's required up to that point where you make your decision. So you've done your individualized assessment, you've sent your pre-adverse action notice, you've given Sam the required waiting period. Sam did not respond and did not dispute, so didn't provide any additional information or anything like that. And you made your final decision after that waiting period was done. So you're not going to move forward with hiring Sam. Now what? Again, your adverse action letter has to have everything the FCRA requires, but on top of that may say something like, we're not proceeding with your employment based on your criminal history, specifically your 2021 conviction for check fraud. And then gives a summary of the individualized assessment. So you can see some sample language on your screen. I won't read it to you, but really just gives you an idea, gives Sam an idea of the factors you considered, how those factors relate to their criminal history and to the role that they applied for, so that they can get a good understanding of why that criminal history may have disqualified them from the position. And lastly, adverse action notices that have to identify the regulators. Again, this is somewhat similar to one of the ones that Alonzo talked through with the pre-adverse action notices. There are some jurisdictions where when you take adverse action against a candidate, the notice has to inform them of their right to file a complaint and identify the regulator who they would file that complaint with. So again, you can see all the jurisdictions up on your screen. I won't read them all to you, but there are a few in California. California is generally the right to file a complaint with the California Civil Rights Department. In Illinois, it's typically the Illinois Department of Human Rights, unless you're in Chicago, and then it's Chicago's Commission on Human Rights. And Gainesville, Florida also has a requirement here. So let's go through one final example. In this example, you're hiring a retail associate in the state of Illinois. We will call this candidate Sarah. Sarah has gone through the interview process, received a conditional offer, you ran a background check, you found a theft conviction that is 3 years old. So you did, again, all of the things that are required up until that point where you make the final decision. So you did your individualized assessment, you sent your pre-adverse action notice, you gave Sarah the waiting period that's required. Sarah didn't dispute or provide any additional information, so you have decided to move forward with taking adverse action. So your final adverse action letter in this scenario, again, includes everything the FCRA requires in the adverse action notice, but then on top of that, may identify the specific criminal history. So in this case, it would be the 2022 theft conviction. And again, gives an overview of the individualized assessment that you conducted. Similar to the last one, you just tried to give them an idea of the factors you considered, how those factors are relevant to their particular situations, to their criminal history, and to the role they applied to, so that they can read that and understand, okay, I got disqualified because of this, and it can make sense to them. And then lastly, you have to include a statement that says you have the right to file a complaint with the Illinois Department of Human Rights. As Alonzo said before, this really isn't an area to try and get super creative, so there's not a whole lot to it. You just have to let them know they have the right to file their complaint with that regulator. You don't need to add a whole lot to that, I don't think. And then the last point I want to touch on really quickly in this section, we've mentioned a few times you've waited the required waiting period. So just want to touch on what that means and what that is, because it actually does vary, as with a lot of things in this space, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So you'll recall that under the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act, employers have to wait a reasonable period of time between the pre-adverse action notice and the adverse action notice. Best practice is to make that a minimum of 5 business days, but that's best practice. The FCRA does not explicitly say you must wait 5 days. That's where ban the box and fair chance laws are a little bit different. Some of them actually do say you must wait a minimum of X days. And you can see on your screen, it's a pretty wide range of time. So it goes all the way from 2 days at the low end to 10 days at the high end with Philadelphia. So you can see the jurisdictions laid out and which ones fall into which category. But again, just really important to know that some of these do mandate specific waiting periods. It's not necessarily just a best practice in some of these jurisdictions. In some jurisdictions, it actually is required that you wait at least 5 days, at least 7 days, at least 10 days. Alonzo, I know there was one jurisdiction that you wanted to touch on that has some special handling that might be required that's kind of new and has a lot to it. So do you want to talk through that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Now that we've reviewed this national landscape, let's zoom in on one of the most complex local laws in effect today. That's the unincorporated Los Angeles County Fair Chance Ordinance. I want to walk through this one just to show you how different ban the box laws can be. This ordinance is one of the, I think it is the most detailed and demanding regulations that we've seen. So I think it's just worth spending a couple minutes on to unpack it step by step. So first off, the law applies to any paid work performed in unincorporated LA County. Again, this is unincorporated LA County. So a note, right? LA County has a ban the box law, and then there is an ordinance for unincorporated LA County. That's a little confusing, I get it. So LA County has its own distinct ban the box law. Unincorporated LA County has its own distinct ban the box law. The two differ, and we're covering unincorporated LA County. So again, law applies to any paid work performed in unincorporated LA County. That includes employees, contractors, freelancers, gig workers. If it happens in unincorporated LA County, the ordinance applies. So here's how it works in practice. You can't request a criminal background check until after extending a conditional offer. And even before that, your job posting, the actual job posting, the advertisement for that job has to list all essential job duties, especially those where a candidate's criminal history might impact their ability to do the work. This means that you need to create a bespoke job posting based on position to demonstrate that nexus between criminal history and that position on the job posting. This is really, really unique. So let's say that you've made that offer, you get the background report back. This is where the process becomes really highly structured. You have to share the background report with the candidate. You can't ask any questions, discussions, no self-disclosure criminal history requests until after the candidate has seen the report. The intent here is to avoid like that gotcha moment, right? Where a candidate maybe doesn't self-disclose their criminal history or discloses different history from what's in front of you. The intent of the ordinance is for the candidate and you to be on the exact same page with respect to their criminal history. You need to be looking at the same data. From there, you can conduct your first individualized assessment. If you're thinking about withdrawing the offer based on that assessment, you have to send a pre-adverse action notice by both mail and email. I mentioned that earlier, but again, this is very unique. You have to send all required communications to the candidate by both mail and email. That pre-adverse action notice has to clearly explain the reason for the potential withdrawal, the candidate's right to respond, and the deadline for that response. And there's a formatting requirement here. The deadline for the response has to be bolded and underlined. If you don't bold and you don't underline the deadline for that response, you have not complied with the unincorporated LA County ordinance. You have to give them at least 5 business days to reply, or 10 if they're disputing the report or gathering additional evidence for you to consider. And if they respond with mitigating information, you're required to send out a second individualized assessment after you've considered that information following the same process. If you still decide to move forward with an adverse action, you have to send a final notice that includes your final decision, a copy of that second individualized assessment, the convictions that influence your decision, and instructions on how to challenge your decision through the unincorporated county or state agencies. One more kind of wrinkle in this whole process, if you know anything about what's going on in California and LA County in particular, it can be difficult to get criminal records back. So if a background check takes more than 30 days, you're going to have to explain that delay in writing to the candidate. So yeah, that's the process. It's layered, it's prescriptive, and it's not something that you can wing. You're going to want to make sure that you plan ahead and make compliance with the unincorporated LA County ordinance part of your normal hiring flow. That is what I wanted to cover regarding unincorporated LA County. Let's talk resources quickly. And here is a quick plug as you continue to get your questions in for our Q&A session. Thank you so much for the engagement. So many questions here, and I'm really excited to dive into those in a second. Before that, we have several outlets of information for you to consume. So if anything in our discussion piqued your interest, check out our resource library, blog, and Forbes articles to learn more. Again, in this webinar, there is our brand new Ban the Box white paper. You can find that in the resource section of this library, of this webinar. And for HireRight customers, I'm really excited. We're sending out a new sample compliance workbench toolkit. These are all of your sample pre-adverse and adverse action templates for your reference. That should be going out to you next week. Generally, your super users will receive that. One more thing, snap that QR code on the screen. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, where I post a short video covering a new compliance topic every single week. So again, if you're not following me on LinkedIn, snap that QR code and look for my LinkedIn videos. So that brings us to the end of today's prepared content. Nicole, do you want to walk us through some of the Q&A?
Absolutely. Yeah, we have a ton of really good questions today. So I'll try and get through as many as we can. Starting off with Washington, we've got a couple of questions about Washington and when the amendments to the Fair Chance Act go into effect. I believe it's 2026 or 2027, depending on the size of your business. I think 15 employees is the cutoff, but Alonzo, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
That's absolutely Yep, that's absolutely right. So generally 2026 for larger employers, 2027 for smaller employers. There's no harm in complying now. And in fact, from a HireRight perspective, we intend to likely turn on flagging, to amend some of our processes to provide employers with the opportunity to comply earlier than the actual effective dates for that particular ordinance. Again, when we send out those new templates to you next week, that's what we're planning, you'll see that the templates have been amended to account for the new processes in Washington State, specifically their modified adverse action process that Nicole walked you through that requires that you include that individualized assessment as part of the adverse action process. So look for that in your inboxes likely next week.
Awesome. And that actually answers a couple of the questions, which were, do we provide samples or templates to help with these jurisdictions where they may have individualized assessment or more nuanced requirements? So yes, we do, as Alonzo said. I think that answered that one. We also have a lot of questions about whether HireRight offers any solutions to help with this. If we have a system where employers can use to conduct their individualized assessments, track these kinds of things. Do you want to talk for just a minute about Compliance Workbench and all the products that we've got?
Absolutely. So Compliance Workbench is a solution, like I mentioned at the top of our call, that's available to you at no cost. So you can implement this on your accounts. If you're a little hesitant about this, you might consider implementing it on one account and seeing how it works. But in a nutshell, what Compliance Workbench does is it flags any criminal history that may be subject to special handling. So that may be subject to a ban the box or fair chance law. So for example, if you have an individual who will work in, let's say, unincorporated LA County, the ban the box process will be invoked. So that means that Compliance Workbench will identify that this individual has criminal history in unincorporated LA County because they're working in unincorporated LA County. It will give you an overview of what's necessary to comply with that particular jurisdiction's requirements. So for example, the individualized assessment requirement, as well as the modified pre-adverse and adverse action notices. And it'll give you the opportunity then to conduct and track that individualized assessment and your communications that are conducted through the platform via Compliance Workbench. And finally, to tailor your individualized assessments, your specialized pre-adverse action notices, and your specialized adverse action notices based on that specific use case. So that candidate's specific criminal history and the specific individualized assessment that you're conducting for that individual. So again, that's all available within Compliance Workbench. If you're not using it and you want to use it, just let us know when you complete the survey at the end of today's webinar.
Excellent. All right, up next, we have a set of questions about screening products other than criminal history. So employment verifications, education verifications, drug testing. If an employer is going to deny employment based on one of those and it has nothing to do with criminal history whatsoever, do any of these laws apply? Do they still have to follow ban the box and fair chance or not?
So remember that ban the box laws and fair chance laws are specific to your consideration, an employer's consideration of a candidate or workers and employees' criminal history. So to answer the question directly, again, these laws are specific to your evaluation of an individual's criminal history. If an individual doesn't meet your hiring criteria based on other things like their employment or education qualifications, or they fail a drug test, then you would follow the standard Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act pre-adverse and adverse action process. You don't need to go through these individualized assessment processes, providing, for example, that individualized assessment. Those nuances are specific to criminal history, although it's always good to document your hiring decisions and why you made those hiring decisions. But again, only follow these processes for criminal history.
All right, we've got a couple of questions asking for lists of states in specific categories. For example, states that require individualized assessment and things of that nature. So Alonzo, I think you mentioned in the resource section, I think our brand new, newly updated Ban the Box white paper is there. So I think that's probably the best HireRight resource that we have for that. Do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. So I think for our general audience today, take a look at that Ban the Box white paper that breaks down each jurisdiction's requirements. For HireRight customers, though, our compliance workbench template does break down the specific requirements of every single jurisdiction. So you'll see that we reference specific templates to specific jurisdictions based on that jurisdiction's requirements. Again, those are available for your reference. They're good samples for you to go ahead and build your own letters and processes off of for use within Compliance Workbench or outside of our platform. Nicole, I think that brings us to the end of our hour and the end of today's session. So with that, thank you so much to our audience. We've covered a lot today: timing restrictions, individualized assessments, local notice requirements, and how to stay compliant across multiple jurisdictions. So whether you're new to screening or a seasoned compliance pro, I hope you walked away with a clearer roadmap and maybe even had a few of those aha moments. I think the takeaway here is that there is no one size fits all approach. And when it comes to compliance, where you're hiring matters just as much as who you're hiring. Before you go, again, take 1 minute to complete our survey. Your feedback helps us improve future sessions, and be on the lookout next week for your SHRM or HRCI credits in the email. And again, for HireRight customers, look out for those compliance workbench templates. With that, on behalf of Nicole, myself, and the entire HireRight team, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.